The precise moment everything spiraled beyond control was when Ethan's fingers, warm and insistent, lingered against mine just a breath too long. We were in my Upper West Side kitchen, a disaster zone of powdered sugar dusting every surface, a rogue egg yolk oozing across the granite, and the scent of pine and gingerbread battling for dominance. Christmas carols, ironically cheerful, played softly from the sonos. To anyone glancing in from the brownstone-lined street, it would have looked like a picture-perfect holiday scene, but it was anything but. Richard, my husband, Ethan's father, had jetted off that morning to close some deal in Tokyo. Christmas Eve was the promised return date, leaving just Ethan and me rattling around the echoing apartment. Baking cookies hadn't been a calculated move, more of a desperate attempt to fill the gaping silence, the void Richard's absence always seemed to amplify. "Pretty sure this isn't how it's supposed to look," Ethan muttered, holding up a blob of dough that resembled a geological anomaly more than holiday cheer. Flour streaked his cheek, and his dark hair was even more disheveled than usual. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound a little too brittle in the otherwise quiet space. "You were supposed to read the recipe, not freestyle it." He grinned, leaning back against the counter, a charmingly crooked smile that had always been his signature. "Creative license. Recipes are so confining." "Confining is one word for it," I said, rolling out another sheet of dough, trying to ignore the way my heart did a little skip at his easygoing charm. Ethan had always possessed this effortless charisma, this knack for turning mundane moments into something that felt charged. It was a huge part of why he was so successful at the game studio we both worked at. His designs were innovative, his ideas the kind that snagged headlines. But outside the office, things were a tightrope walk. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment I'd started seeing him differently. Maybe it was the way he'd laugh at my jokes, even the truly terrible ones, or the way he'd stay late, poring over project details with me long after everyone else had bolted for happy hour. Or maybe it was just the way he'd look at me sometimes, a gaze that lingered a beat too long, as if I held some secret he was trying to decipher. Initially, I dismissed it as stepson adoration, a slightly intense but ultimately harmless appreciation. After all, I was his stepmother, married to his father. End of story. But standing there in the kitchen, watching him roll up his sleeves, a smirk playing on his lips like we were sharing some illicit joke, my carefully constructed resolve began to crumble. "Here," I said, stepping closer than strictly necessary. "Let me show you." Ethan handed me the rolling pin, his fingers brushing mine in the transfer. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up my arm. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the dough, the task at hand. "You need to press evenly, like this," I demonstrated, guiding the pin with deliberate movements. He moved closer still, leaning over my shoulder to watch, his chest grazing my back. My breath hitched. "Like this?" he murmured, his voice low, a warm rumble against my ear. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, just like that." The air between us thickened, heavy with something unspoken, something dangerous. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the subtle scent of his cologne, a crisp, masculine fragrance that mingled with the sweet cinnamon in the air. I told myself it was nothing, just proximity, just holiday baking. Then he reached out, his hand settling lightly over mine as I guided the rolling pin. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew I should step away, create some distance, make a casual excuse to break the tension. But I was frozen, caught in the pull of something I couldn't name, didn't want to name. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. I turned to look at him, and the sliver of space between us vanished. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and searching, and for a dizzying moment, the kitchen, the Christmas music, the entire city seemed to fade away. "We shouldn't," I managed, my voice trembling. "I know," he breathed, his hand still warm on mine, "but it doesn't feel wrong." His words hung in the air, a dangerous invitation. I knew I should shut it down, extinguish the flicker of something illicit before it ignited into a full-blown inferno. But the truth, the terrifying truth, was that I didn't want to. It wasn't just the way he looked at me or the casual brush of his hand. It was the way he made me feel. Alive, seen, wanted. When he leaned in, I didn't resist. His lips brushed against mine, tentative, feather-light at first, then deepening, becoming more insistent, more demanding. My resolve crumbled. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, and I felt myself melting into him, the counter pressing into my back, his body molding against mine. For a stolen moment, all the guilt, all the fear, all the years of playing the dutiful wife vanished. It was the shrill beep of the oven timer that shattered the spell, dragging us back to reality, breathless and wide-eyed. We can't do this, I gasped, stumbling back, putting precious inches between us. I know, he said, his voice steadier than mine, his gaze unwavering, but that doesn't change how I feel. My heart ached at his words, a confusing mix of fear and something dangerously close to elation. I wanted to tell him I felt it too, this impossible, reckless pull, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned away, pretending to fuss with the cookie sheets, the half-baked pretense of normalcy. Your father will be home soon, I said, trying for a casual tone that felt utterly false. Ethan didn't press it. He just nodded, the unspoken tension simmering between us as we finished baking in strained silence. Later that night, after Ethan had retreated to his room, a closed door that felt more like a chasm, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. What had I done? Mistake, I told myself. A moment of holiday madness. It wouldn't happen again. But deep down, a terrifying voice whispered the truth. The kiss had been a spark, and now there was no putting out the fire. The days that followed were a dizzying blur of conflicting emotions. Guilt, sharp and persistent, gnawed at me. Excitement, illicit and intoxicating, pulsed beneath the surface. Fear, cold and clammy, coiled in my stomach. They twisted together, a painful knot that tightened every time I saw Ethan, which, given we worked together, was constantly. We didn't speak of the kitchen, the kiss, the unspoken. But the air between us crackled with it, a silent, electric current. I threw myself into work, hoping deadlines and endless meetings would be a sufficient distraction, a shield against the dangerous pull of Ethan. But working alongside him, day after day, only amplified the torment. It had started weeks before the kitchen, before the cookies, before the kiss that had ripped the fabric of my carefully constructed life. During one of those soul-crushing late nights at the office, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the pressure of the looming holiday launch, Ethan had been tasked with designing a new character for our Christmas-themed game. His sketches were breathtaking, bursting with life and quirky personality. I found myself inexplicably drawn to the way he lost himself in his work, the furrow of concentration between his brows, the way his eyes lit up when he landed on a detail he loved. Olivia, what do you think of this one? He'd asked, holding up a concept sketch, his voice rumbling with a fatigue that mirrored my own. I leaned over his desk, ostensibly to study the drawing, but really just to be closer to him. The character was whimsical, endearing, full of subtle details that made it feel utterly real. It's perfect, I said, meaning it with a sincerity that surprised even me. He grinned, that boyish, lopsided smile that always managed to do something unsettling to my chest. Thanks. Wasn't sure about the color palette, but if you like it, I'll run with it. It's great, Ethan, I repeated, straightening up, trying to inject some professional detachment into my voice. You have a real talent for this, you know. His smile faltered, just for a moment, and he looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like he was searching for something hidden beneath the surface of my carefully crafted professional persona. Means a lot, hearing that from you. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and retreated back to my desk, the heat of his gaze lingering long after the conversation ended. A week later, the entire team was dispatched to a gaming conference in Chicago, supposed to be a simple 3-day trip. Attend panels, showcase our game, network with industry professionals. But as always, things deviated from the plan. The first night, after a marathon day of convention chaos, the team decided to hit a bar. I almost bowed out, a part of me desperately wanting to retreat to the sterile sanctuary of my hotel room and avoid the inevitable social maelstrom. But Madison, ever the enthusiastic social director, wouldn't hear of it. Come on, Olivia, she'd insisted, linking her arm through mine, her energy infectious. You never let loose. One drink won't kill you. We ended up at a crowded bar near the convention center, the kind of place that pulsed with bass and flashing lights. The music was deafening, the lights dim, and the energy in the room was almost aggressively electric. Ethan sat across from me at the table, nursing a beer, laughing at something Madison had said. I tried to focus on the conversation, on the forced camaraderie of the team outing, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. The way his smile lit up his face, the way he ran a hand through his already tousled hair when he laughed, the easy confidence he exuded even in this chaotic environment. It was maddening, this constant, unwelcome awareness of him. At some point, Madison and the others migrated to the dance floor, lured by the thumping beat, leaving Ethan and me stranded at the table, suddenly, jarringly alone. You don't dance, do you? He asked, raising an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his voice. Not my thing, I said, taking a sip of my wine, the alcohol doing little to calm the nervous flutter in my stomach. Me neither, he echoed, leaning back in his chair, his gaze steady on mine. Too many people, too much noise. I laughed, a genuine sound this time, tinged with relief. So why are you here? He shrugged, his gaze never wavering, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Because you are. For a moment, the noise of the bar faded, the flashing lights dimmed, and it was just us, suspended in a bubble of unspoken tension. Before I could formulate a response, before I could dissect the meaning behind his words, he stood and held out his hand. Come on, he said, a hint of urgency in his voice. Let's get out of here. We ended up at a quiet cafe a few blocks away, a haven of mismatched mugs and hushed conversation, the kind of place that stayed open late, a refuge from the manufactured frenzy of the convention. Needed a break from all that noise, he said as we settled into a booth tucked away in the back. Me too, I admitted, grateful for the sudden shift in atmosphere, the quiet intimacy of the dimly lit cafe. We talked for hours that night, a conversation that flowed effortlessly, touching on everything and nothing. He told me about his college days, his accidental stumble into game design, the ambitious dreams of one day launching his own studio. I confided in him about my early career struggles, the years of grinding to climb the corporate ladder to creative director, the complex mix of passion and stress that fueled my ambition. You're amazing, you know that, he said, his voice soft, sincere. I laughed, shaking my head, dismissing his compliment with practiced ease. I'm just doing my job. No, he insisted, leaning forward, his eyes earnest. You're more than that. You're smart, talented, and God, Olivia, you're beautiful. His words caught me completely off guard. I felt my cheeks flush, a hot wave rising up my neck. Ethan, don't be... I started trying to deflect to diffuse the sudden intensity. I'm serious, he interrupted, his eyes locked on mine, unwavering. You have no idea how much I admire you. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to tell him he was just being kind, caught up in the late-night intimacy of the moment. But another, more dangerous part of me, the part I usually kept locked away, wanted desperately to believe him. Later that night, as we walked back to the hotel, the tension between us was almost palpable. The streets were quiet, the Chicago air sharp and cold against my skin. When we reached the hotel lobby, I hesitated, suddenly reluctant to say goodnight, to end the fragile intimacy that had blossomed in the quiet cafe. Olivia, he said, stepping closer, closing the space between us. I know this is complicated, incredibly so, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. His words hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond, to finally articulate the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside me. But before I could speak, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't tentative, not like the kitchen kiss. This was raw, urgent, full of pent-up emotion, like he'd been holding back for too long and the dam had finally broken. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away, reminded him of the impossible chasm between us, the web of complications that would inevitably ensnare us. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair, the weeks of unspoken tension, the forbidden longing surging to the surface. When we finally broke apart, breathless, shaken, I was a mess of conflicting emotions. This can't happen, I whispered, my voice trembling, the cold reality crashing down around us. I know, he said, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of regret, desire, and something like defiance. But it already has. We didn't speak of it the next day, navigating the convention with a strained politeness that fooled no one, least of all ourselves. But everything had irrevocably shifted. The line had been crossed, the boundary blurred, and there was no going back to the carefully constructed pretense of normalcy. Back at the office in New York, we tried, desperately, to act as if Chicago, as if the kiss had never happened. But the stolen glances, the accidental brushes in the hallway, the charged silences that stretched between us during meetings, it was all there, simmering beneath the surface, a constant, low-level hum of tension. I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. By the time Christmas week rolled around, Ethan and I had slipped into something that felt terrifyingly beyond my control. It wasn't planned, not something we'd ever consciously discussed or plotted. But after that night in the kitchen, after the confession in Chicago, a door had opened between us, a forbidden passage that neither of us seemed willing or able to close. It started with stolen moments at work, fleeting and seemingly innocuous at first. He'd linger at my desk a little longer than necessary, asking about a project detail that could have easily been an email, or I'd find excuses to walk past his workstation, feigning a need to consult on a design element. We'd exchange glances during meetings, quick, loaded with meaning that no one else seemed to catch. But those tentative moments quickly escalated. One late afternoon, as the office emptied out, the city lights beginning to twinkle outside the panoramic windows, I found myself in the cramped storage room down the hall, searching for presentation supplies. When I turned around, Ethan was standing in the doorway. "Hey," he said, his voice low, husky. I froze, the air in the small room suddenly thick, the tension between us immediate and electrifying. "Ethan, you can't—" "I know," he said, stepping inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed in the confined space. I needed to see you." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The storage room was tiny, barely enough space for two people to stand without brushing against each other. The air felt heavy, suffocating with unspoken desires, forbidden longings. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered. But my voice lacked conviction, the protest weak, almost inviting. "Do you want me to go?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine, searching, pleading. I couldn't answer. The rational part of my brain was screaming at him to leave, to create distance, to salvage what little remained of my crumbling life before we crossed a point of no return. But another part, a reckless, desperate part, the part that had been aching for him, the part that couldn't stop replaying the feel of his lips on mine, wanted him to stay, to close the door, to silence the screaming voice of reason. When he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, a feather-light touch that sent sparks through my veins, I didn't pull away. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered, his voice raw, urgent. Before I could formulate a response, his lips were on mine, the kiss desperate, hungry, a release of weeks of pent-up longing. And I found myself giving in, surrendering to the forbidden desire, my hands tangling in his hair, the carefully constructed walls of my life crumbling around me as weeks of tension erupted into something neither of us could control. The storage room became our secret sanctuary. Over the next few weeks, we found stolen moments, snatched fragments of time, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. The constant risk of being caught, the ever-present danger of exposure, only heightened the thrill, adding a dangerous edge to our clandestine encounters. And I found myself craving those stolen moments with him, the forbidden intimacy, more than I wanted to admit, even to myself. At home, things were a carefully constructed facade, a performance of normalcy played out in a hollow theater. Richard was still consumed by work, his attention perpetually fixed on conference calls and client meetings, his presence in the apartment more ghostly than real. He barely registered when I stayed late at the office, dismissing my excuses with a distracted nod, his mind already miles away, focused on deals and deadlines. But Ethan was always there, a constant, magnetic presence that I couldn't ignore, even when I tried. One night, when Richard was locked away in his home office, the glow of his laptop screen spilling out from under the closed door, I found Ethan in the living room. He was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone, the muted light from the screen illuminating his face. When he looked up at me, something in his gaze, a mixture of longing and vulnerability, made my breath catch. "You okay?" he asked, sitting up, tossing his phone aside. His voice was softer, gentler than usual. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, words failing me. "Yeah, just tired." "Come here," he said, patting the space next to him on the couch. I hesitated for a moment, the unspoken invitation hanging heavy in the air. Then, drawn by an invisible force, I sat down, the plush cushions sinking beneath me. The couch felt too small, the space between us too intimate. "Long day?" he asked, his voice low, soothing, a balm to my frayed nerves. "You could say that," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual, to mask the turmoil churning beneath the surface. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the television, flickering silently in the corner, and the heavy silence that stretched between us, charged with unspoken desires, forbidden emotions. "Olivia," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, breaking the fragile silence. I turned to look at him, and before I fully registered the movement, before I could formulate a protest or pull away, his lips were on mine. This kiss was different from the frantic, desperate encounters in the storage room. This was slow, deliberate, almost tender, a stark contrast to the furtive urgency of our stolen moments. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, molding my body against his, and I felt myself melting into him, the weight of the day, the weight of my life, momentarily fading away, leaving only the intoxicating sensation of his touch, the forbidden sweetness of his kiss. It wasn't long before our affair, once confined to stolen moments in the office, began to spill out into other corners of our lives. We started meeting in secret, clandestine rendezvous orchestrated with the precision of spies. His car, parked in a secluded corner of Central Park, a quiet, overlooked bench in a less traveled section of Riverside Park. Even a hotel room downtown, once, when Richard was out of town for an extended business trip, a luxurious, terrifying plunge into the deep end of our deception. Every moment with him felt stolen, precious, like we were living on borrowed time, suspended in a fragile bubble of illicit desire. The first time we went to the hotel, I nearly backed out. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, threatened to overwhelm me. The weight of what we were doing, the potential for catastrophic fallout, pressed down on me like a physical burden. But the moment I saw him waiting for me in the lobby, his eyes searching for mine, a nervous anticipation flickering in their depths, all my doubts, all my carefully constructed reservations melted away. The room was small, anonymous, but in that moment, it felt like the most luxurious, most forbidden space in the city. The moment the door closed behind us, sealing us off from the world, from Richard, from the consequences, he pulled me into his arms, his embrace tight, desperate. "I've been thinking about this all day," he murmured, his voice rough with need, his breath warm against my ear. "Me too," I admitted, my cheeks flushing, the confession a release, a surrender. The hours we spent in that room were a blur of tangled sheets, whispered confessions, stolen kisses. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, truly seen, truly wanted. But the more time we spent together, the more entangled our lives became, the harder it became to maintain the carefully constructed facade, to hide the truth from the world and from Richard. Madison, ever perceptive, started to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior, the almost imperceptible cracks in my carefully constructed composure. "You seem different lately," she remarked one afternoon as we grabbed coffee during a meeting break. Her eyes narrowed, studying me with an unnerving intensity. "Different?" I asked, trying to sound casual, my heart hammering against my ribs. "How so?" "I don't know," she shrugged, but her gaze remained fixed, probing. "Happier, maybe, lighter." She paused, a curious smile playing on her lips. "Whatever it is, keep doing it." Her words sent a pang of guilt, sharp and immediate, through me. If only she knew the real source of my newfound lightness, the dangerous secret that fueled my stolen moments of joy. At the same time, Richard began to ask more questions, his casual inquiries morphing into pointed interrogations. "You've been working late a lot lately," he observed one evening over dinner, his tone deceptively mild. "Things have been busy," I replied, keeping my voice light, airy, trying to deflect his growing suspicion. "The holiday project, you know." "Too busy to spend time with your family?" he countered, his tone now laced with something sharper, something I couldn't quite place. Suspicion? Resentment? Anger? I forced a smile, the muscles in my face aching with the effort. "It's just temporary, Richard. Once the holiday project is finished, things will slow down." He didn't press the issue further that night, but I could feel the tension coiling between us, a silent, invisible thread tightening with each passing day. Despite the mounting risks, despite the suffocating guilt, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Ethan. Every time I considered walking away, severing the connection, the thought of losing him, of returning to the hollow routine of my life with Richard, felt unbearable. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I knew the potential fallout, the catastrophic damage that would be unleashed if anyone, especially Richard, discovered the truth. But when I was with Ethan, in those stolen moments, none of that seemed to matter. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive, truly myself, and I wasn't ready, couldn't bear to let that fragile spark go. The weeks that followed were a precarious balancing act, a high-wire performance that tested every ounce of my composure. On the surface, I maintained the carefully constructed facade of a dutiful wife, a focused creative director, a stepmother who had everything under control. But underneath, my life was a chaotic mess, a tangled web of lies and stolen moments, teetering on the brink of collapse. Ethan and I were playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks began to show, before the carefully constructed illusion shattered. It started with the close calls, the near misses that sent ice shivers of fear down my spine. One night, Richard came home earlier than expected, a sudden shift in his schedule that threw my carefully planned evening into chaos. I just slipped out of Ethan's room, my hair still slightly disheveled, my heart racing, when I heard the telltale click of Richard's key in the front door. "Vanessa," Richard called, his voice carrying through the hallway, closer than it should have been. I froze, my mind scrambling for an excuse, for a plausible explanation for my disarray. "In here!" I called back, my voice a little too high-pitched, a little too breathless. I darted into the kitchen, grabbing a dish towel, frantically wiping down the already spotless countertop, trying to create the illusion of domesticity, of innocent activity. Richard walked in, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened, a weary but subtly suspicious expression on his face. He gave me a slow, appraising look. "What are you doing?" "Just tidying up," I stammered, forcing a smile that felt utterly fake. "You're home early." "Meeting wrapped up ahead of schedule," he said, setting his briefcase heavily on the counter, his eyes still lingering on me, scrutinizing my every move. I felt like I was standing under a harsh spotlight, every detail magnified, every lie exposed. "You okay?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual, but his gaze sharp, guarded. "Of course," I said, turning back to the counter, pretending to fuss with a stack of cookbooks, trying to hide the flush creeping up my neck, the telltale signs of guilt. Why wouldn't I be? He didn't answer, but I could feel his gaze still fixed on me, a silent interrogation that left me breathless and trembling. The office wasn't any easier. Ashley, always sharp and observant, with a knack for noticing the unspoken currents beneath the surface, had started to pick up on the subtle shifts in my behavior, the charged undercurrent between Ethan and me. "You've been awfully close to Ethan lately," she remarked one afternoon as we prepped for a client meeting, her tone deceptively light, but her eyes narrowed, shrewd. I kept my tone equally casual, even as my stomach twisted into a knot of anxiety. "Ethan's a valuable member of the team. We work well together." "Ah, yes," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Teamwork." She paused, her gaze locking onto mine, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Just be careful, Olivia. People talk." The implication in her words, the veiled warning, sent a chill down my spine. I laughed it off, pretending to find her comment amusing, but I knew Ashley wasn't the type to let things slide, to ignore the whispers, the undercurrents. She was a collector of secrets, a master of subtle observation, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was watching, waiting, piecing together the fragments of truth that I was desperately trying to conceal. Despite the growing tension, despite the constant fear of exposure, Ethan and I couldn't stay away from each other. If anything, the risks, the near misses, only intensified the forbidden thrill, making our stolen moments together even more potent, more addictive. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the darkened conference room after a particularly grueling client presentation. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in a dim, shadowy light, the soft hum of the projector the only sound in the otherwise silent space. As I packed up my notes, my hands trembling slightly, Ethan lingered by the door, his eyes scanning the empty hallway, checking for any unwanted witnesses before he turned back to me, a mischievous grin playing on his lips. "Close call with Ashley earlier," he murmured, his voice low, conspiratorial. "She's just nosy," I replied, though my voice betrayed my nerves, the forced lightness sounding brittle and false even to my own ears. He stepped closer, closing the space between us, his hand brushing against mine as he helped me gather the scattered papers, the casual touch sending a jolt of electricity through my veins. "You're tense," he said softly, his gaze locking onto mine, his fingers lingering on my hand. "Can you blame me?" I asked, glancing up at him, my breath catching in my throat. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his gaze unwavering, intense, "but I don't regret any of it." The room suddenly felt too small, the air between us charged, thick with unspoken desires, forbidden promises. Before I could formulate a response, before I could even process the dangerous intimacy of the moment, he leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that stole my breath, a kiss that erased the fear, the risk, the looming threat of exposure. It was reckless, dangerous, utterly irresponsible. But in that moment, lost in the forbidden sweetness of his embrace, I couldn't bring myself to care. At home, things were unraveling faster than I could keep up. Richard's questions became more frequent, more pointed, his suspicion hardening into a cold, unwavering certainty. "You've been different lately," he said one evening as we sat down to a strained, silent dinner, his tone flat, accusatory. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully casual, pretending to misunderstand. "I don't know," he said, studying me with a cold, detached gaze that sent a shiver of fear down my spine. "Distracted, distant." He paused, his eyes narrowing, preoccupied. I forced a laugh. a hollow, brittle sound that echoed in the strained silence. "Work's been stressful, Richard, that's all." He didn't look convinced. His gaze remained fixed, scrutinizing, but he let it drop, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air between us. Later that night, I found Ethan in the kitchen, the refrigerator humming softly in the otherwise silent apartment. His expression was tense, drawn, as he leaned against the counter, staring into the middle distance. "He knows something's up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words heavy with dread. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Does he know about us?" "No," I said quickly, vehemently, the denial automatic, reflexive. "Not yet, but he's suspicious, he's watching me." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his frustration evident in the sharp, jerky movement. Maybe we should back off for a while," he suggested, the words hesitant, reluctant. The suggestion hit me like a punch to the gut, a cold, sickening wave of panic washing over me. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling, the carefully constructed walls of my composure threatening to crumble completely. "I'm saying, I don't want to risk losing you," he said, his voice softening, his gaze searching mine. "But I don't want to hurt you either." The thought of pulling away from him, of severing the fragile connection that had become the only source of light in my increasingly dark world, felt unbearable. I knew he was right, logically, rationally, but the idea of ending things, of returning to the hollow pretense of my life with Richard, made my chest ache with a suffocating despair. "I can't," I said finally, my voice barely audible, choked with emotion, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. He stepped closer, reaching out, his hand brushing against mine, his touch a lifeline in the swirling chaos of my emotions. "Neither can I." The turning point, the moment of inevitable, catastrophic unraveling, came just a week later. Richard's suspicion had escalated into open hostility, his questions becoming more aggressive, more accusatory. One evening he confronted me in the living room, his voice sharp, demanding, no longer veiled in polite pretense. "Are you having an affair?" he asked bluntly, the question hanging in the air like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The directness of his accusation, the raw anger in his voice, stripped away the last vestiges of my denial, leaving me exposed, vulnerable. "What? No," I stammered, my voice shaking, the denial weak, unconvincing even to my own ears. "Why would you even think that?" "Because you've been distant, Olivia," he said, his voice rising, his anger now palpable. "Distracted. You're always working late, always finding excuses to stay out of the house." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "Something's going on, Vanessa. I know it." I forced myself to stay calm, to maintain the pretense of innocence, to keep my voice steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to betray me. "Richard, you're imagining things. Work's been busy, that's all." "Don't lie to me," he said sharply, his voice rising further, cracking with anger. "I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you." My blood ran cold. My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, the denial now a desperate, futile attempt to cling to the crumbling illusion. "Then," he spat out his name, his voice dripping with disgust. "Do you think I haven't noticed? The two of you, whispering at dinner, the way you're always finding excuses to be alone together." I opened my mouth to deny it, to offer another flimsy lie, but the look on his face, the raw pain and fury in his eyes, told me it was useless. The jig was up. The carefully constructed facade had shattered, leaving me exposed, defenseless. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his hands gripping the edge of the dining table, his knuckles white with strain. "It's not what you think," I began, another automatic denial, but he cut me off, his voice a thunderous roar. "How long?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent apartment. The truth spilled out of me, a torrent of confession I couldn't contain, couldn't stop. "A few months," I whispered, the words barely audible, a pathetic admission of guilt. Richard stared at me, his face a mask of shock and fury, his eyes blazing with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't say anything. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of my heart, the ragged sound of my own breathing. "You disgust me," he said finally, his voice cold, flat, devoid of emotion, a chilling pronouncement of judgment. Tears streamed down my face, hot, silent tears of shame and regret. But I couldn't bring myself to speak. to offer any excuse, any apology. I knew in that moment that words were useless, that the damage was irreparable. "You've destroyed this family," he said, his voice still cold, still flat, the words like shards of ice. He stood abruptly, grabbing his briefcase from the floor. I hope it was worth it. With that, he turned and walked out the door, slamming it shut behind him, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of my life. I found Ethan in his room later that night, his face pale, drawn, his eyes haunted. "He knows," I said, my voice shaking, the words a statement of fact, not a question. He nodded, his jaw tight, his expression grim. I figured. "What are we going to do?" I asked, the question desperate, pleading, tears streaming down my face. He reached out, pulling me into his arms, his embrace a desperate comfort. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, his voice a fragile promise. "We always do." But the uncertainty in his voice, the lack of conviction in his words, told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. The fallout was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. Richard moved out the next day, leaving behind a curt note on the kitchen counter, a cold, impersonal severing, and a promise to have his lawyer contact me. At work, the tension between Ethan and me was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was a gaping chasm, impossible to ignore, impossible to bridge. Ashley's knowing glances became sharper, her casual comments more pointed, more accusatory. "You might want to be careful, Olivia," she said one afternoon as we crossed paths in the hallway, her voice saccharine sweet, her eyes like daggers. "People are starting to talk." The weight of her words pressed down on me, suffocating, crushing. That night, Ethan and I sat together in the living room, the flickering glow of the Christmas tree casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. We didn't speak for a long time, the silence heavy with unspoken grief, with the weight of our impossible situation. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice breaking, the words a painful admission of defeat. He nodded, his expression pained, his eyes reflecting the flickering Christmas lights, the dying embers of our forbidden love. "I know. I love you," I said, tears streaming down my face, a confession that felt both like a desperate plea and a final farewell. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But maybe loving each other isn't enough." The words hit me like a physical blow, a brutal, undeniable truth. But deep down, a part of me, a bruised and broken part, already knew he was right. The weeks after Richard left were a numb, agonizing blur. At first, I'd thought I'd feel relief, a sense of liberation now that the secret was out, the lies exposed, the constant tension of hiding our affair finally lifted. But the reality was far worse, more devastating than anything I could have imagined. Richard hadn't just walked out on me, he'd walked out on our life, on everything we'd built together, leaving behind a hollow shell of an apartment, cold and empty, the silence deafening, accusing. The weight of what I'd done, the magnitude of my betrayal, pressed down on me in ways I hadn't anticipated, crushing me beneath its unbearable weight. Every room in the apartment felt like a monument to the family I'd destroyed. Every glance from Ethan a constant, painful reminder of the impossible situation we'd created for ourselves. The fallout at work was just as catastrophic. Ashley, ever the opportunist, ever the corporate shark, had clearly pieced everything together, and the whispers, the rumors, the barely veiled hostility became a suffocating cloud that followed me through the office. Madison, once my closest friend, now kept a polite, strained distance, her eyes averted, her warmth replaced by a chilling formality. "Everything okay, Olivia?" she'd ask occasionally, her tone saccharine sweet, her gaze sharp, probing. "Fine," I'd force myself to say, the lie a bitter taste in my mouth. She'd just tilt her head, her expression a mixture of pity and something colder, something like judgment. "Just making sure. You've seemed a little distracted lately." I wanted to snap at her, to unleash the torrent of pain and anger that was threatening to consume me, to tell her to mind her own business, to stop dissecting my life with her cold, clinical gaze. But I knew that would only make things worse, only fuel the gossip, the whispers, the inevitable corporate reckoning. The real blow came a few days later, during a tense, icy meeting with the senior leadership team. Ethan and I had been avoiding each other at work as much as possible, communicating through terse emails and carefully worded memos, the physical distance a desperate attempt to mitigate the damage, to quell the rising tide of rumors. But the tension was still palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that filled the conference room. "I've heard some concerns about your team." one of the executives said, his voice cold, detached, his eyes flicking pointedly between me and Ethan, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. Concerns? I asked, my stomach clenching, the blood draining from my face. What kind of concerns? Just whispers, he said vaguely, his tone dismissive, but his meaning crystal clear. But it might be worth addressing them before things get out of hand. The message was unmistakable. People were talking, the rumors were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before the whispers reached someone with the power to take action, someone who would see our affair not just as a personal betrayal, but as a corporate liability. At home, things were no better. Ethan and I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, to navigate the wreckage of our lives with a fragile, forced composure. But the weight of what had happened, the crushing reality of our situation, hung over us like a storm cloud, darkening every room, silencing every conversation. One night, as we sat together in the living room, the silence between us thick, unbearable, I finally broke. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I said, my voice trembling, the words a raw, honest admission of defeat. He looked at me, his expression pained, his eyes filled with a mirroring despair. "Do what?" "This," I said, gesturing vaguely around the room, encompassing the apartment, our lives, the impossible mess we'd made of everything. Pretending like everything's fine when it's not, living with this constant pressure. Ethan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of him. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I feel it too." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, the distant sirens, the muffled rumble of traffic, a constant reminder of the world continuing to spin, oblivious to the personal cataclysm unfolding within the walls of our apartment. The glow of the Christmas tree cast long, distorted shadows across the room, the faint hum of holiday music playing softly in the background. A cruel, ironic soundtrack to our unraveling. "I love you," he said finally, his voice breaking, the words a desperate plea in the face of overwhelming despair. "I love you too," I said, tears streaming down my face, the confession a bittersweet echo of a love that had become a destructive force. But maybe that's not enough. His eyes searched mine, a desperate plea for reassurance, for a way out of the impossible situation we were trapped in. But I had no answers, no solutions, only the crushing weight of reality, the dawning realization that some loves, no matter how deeply felt, were simply not meant to be. "What are you saying?" he whispered, his voice raw with fear. "I don't know," I said honestly, the words a defeated admission of my own helplessness. I don't know how to fix this." The breaking point, the final, irreversible fracture, came a few days later. Alyssa Madison, my closest friend at work, the one person I had always confided in, the one person who had always offered unwavering support, confronted me, her face etched with concern, her voice filled with a painful mixture of disappointment and worry. "I need to ask you something," she said, pulling me aside after a particularly tense team meeting, her expression grave. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding, bracing myself for the inevitable. She hesitated, her expression conflicted, torn between loyalty and the painful truth she felt compelled to confront. "Are you and Ethan involved?" The question hit me like a physical blow, the directness of it stripping away the last vestiges of denial. I opened my mouth to deny it, to offer another flimsy lie, another desperate attempt to salvage what little remained of my shattered life. But the look on her face, the genuine concern in her eyes, told me it was useless. She already knew. "Alyssa, I stammered, the words failing me, the weight of my guilt overwhelming. She held up a hand, stopping me, her expression softening, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I don't need the details, Olivia," she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. I just need to know if it's true." I nodded, a single, defeated nod, my throat tightening, tears welling in my eyes. She let out a long, weary sigh, shaking her head slowly, her disappointment palpable. "Vanessa," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on mine, filled with a mixture of pity and concern. "This is bad. You know that, right?" "I know," I whispered back, my voice barely audible, choked with emotion. "I'm not going to say anything," she said, her voice low, conspiratorial. "But people are already talking, Olivia. If this gets out—" She trailed off, her expression grim, leaving the unspoken consequences hanging heavy in the air. "I know," I repeated, the words a hollow echo of my own despair, tears welling in my eyes, blurring my vision. That night, Ethan and I sat together in his room, the weight of everything pressing down on us, suffocating, inescapable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling, the words heavy with finality. He looked up at me, his expression guarded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "About what?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between us. "About us," I said, the words a painful admission of defeat. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening, his gaze fixed on mine, unwavering. "About us," he echoed, the words heavy with unspoken grief. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, to find the strength to say the words that needed to be said, the words that would shatter the fragile illusion we'd been clinging to. This isn't sustainable, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, the words tearing at my heart. "We're hurting everyone around us, and we're hurting ourselves." "I know," he said, his voice barely audible, a defeated whisper. "I love you," I said, tears streaming down my face, a final, desperate confession of a love that had become a destructive force. But maybe loving each other isn't enough. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on mine, his expression a mixture of pain, resignation, and a heartbreaking understanding. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out, taking my hand in his touch warm, familiar, a bittersweet reminder of everything we were about to lose. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking, the words a raw, honest expression of his own grief. "You're not going to," I said, my voice trembling, tears streaming down my face. "But we need to stop, for both our sakes." The next morning, Ethan packed his things and left. He didn't say where he was going, and I didn't ask. Watching him walk out the door, suitcase in hand, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I knew, with a certainty that ached in my soul, that it was the right thing, the only thing left to do. For weeks after he left, I felt like a ghost, drifting through my life without purpose, without direction. The apartment felt emptier than ever, the silence deafening, accusing. I tried to throw myself into work, to bury myself in deadlines and projects, but the whispers, the rumors, the cold, judgmental glances made it impossible to focus, impossible to function. Eventually, broken and defeated, I handed in my resignation, walking away from the career I'd spent years building, the life I'd so carefully constructed, leaving it all behind in ruins. Months later, in the muted light of a downtown coffee shop, I ran into Ethan. He looked different, older, more serious, the easy charm replaced by a quiet gravity. But the moment our eyes met, across the crowded cafe, it felt like no time had passed at all, the connection still raw, still potent. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice filled with a complex mixture of emotions, regret, longing, a lingering tenderness. "Then," I replied, my heart aching at the sight of him, the familiar pang of loss hitting me with unexpected force. We sat together for a while, amidst the clatter of coffee cups and the murmur of conversations, catching up on the fragmented pieces of our separate lives, filling in the gaps of the months we'd spent apart. He told me about his new job, a smaller independent studio downtown, a chance to finally pursue his own creative vision. He told me about his new apartment, a minimalist space in Brooklyn, a fresh start, a clean slate. He spoke of his plans for the future, tentative, hopeful, a fragile rebuilding. I told him about my new role at a smaller studio, a low-pressure environment, a chance to slowly, painstakingly rebuild my life, piece by piece from the wreckage of the old. When it was time to leave, the unspoken weight of our shared past hanging heavy in the air between us, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine, a fleeting, almost hesitant touch that sent a familiar jolt through my veins. "I'll always love you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, the words a bittersweet echo of a love that had burned too brightly, too destructively. "I'll always love you too," I replied, tears welling in my eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the enduring power of a love that had changed everything, that had broken everything, that was never meant to last. And then, with a final, lingering glance, he walked away, leaving me alone with the bittersweet knowledge that some loves, no matter how deeply, how passionately felt, are simply not meant to be.